Check, check. Test one, two. Check, check, check. Test, test. Check one, two. Test, test, test. Can you hear me, Jeremy?
future you hold. Scream like a many arms of see them.
Check, 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 check. Check 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Check 1.
good. So, test, test. Are we on? So, I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about why we're here and all that stuff, and then why don't we? It's up to you. I think you should stand myself. Yeah, I'm going to stand because it's just you're gonna have, yeah, you can move around. Yeah, and you have the clicker and stuff, right? Let's get that. So are we hot? Okay, we're gonna try to get seated. If I can get everybody to get a drink or whatever and find a seat, that would be terrific. Exactly. Get seated. Let's go. Thank you. Yeah, right? Boy, that got quiet in a hurry. I don't think that's ever happened. So we got lots of seats up here. If we can get everybody up toward the stage, that would be terrific. Hey, Brian, from way back there, the bar. That could be difficult getting people removed from the bar. All right, we got lots of seats back in this area. You got a better view from there. That would be terrific. Just getting people moving. All right. Anybody else up on the deck? All right, we're making progress. Timing's good. Those are pretty good seats over here, right? This is the first time we tried those. Those are the first class seats. If you didn't know it, you're going to get charged for that. Jamie, how are we doing back there? We get everybody out of the conference rooms and the bar and all that stuff. Mike, are you coming? All right. We ready to get this started? So on behalf of Jamie, my co-founder, welcome to TrueSpace. Tonight's going to be kind of an exciting night, and probably the greatest of which is you gave me an excuse to wear this coat. So I'm feeling really good about that because I got to try it out. Thanks for giving me the feedback for it. I appreciate that. This is an exciting night for us, in part because we get to introduce a partner that will define TrueSpace, what we do, our mission, how we advance in the vision that we have around small business. And you're all a big part of this. So you were all hand-selected. The people in this room were personally invited for a reason, to be here, to listen to our message, to get to know each other. But I want to talk real briefly about what is TrueSpace and why are we doing this event. for those of you that might have come in for the first time, because there's many of you in the room that have been at least with us for probably the better part of the last year. The mission that Jamie and I had when we started 6 years ago, June 1st of this year, marks our 6th year of actually working on this project. And as we exited a business that we built called the Breakaway Group, we decided that what we wanted to really do is to focus on the jobs that we saw that were of high value in businesses that were building, not just starting. Our focus is entirely on building businesses, not starting them. And those poor souls, many of you are in this room today that made it through the startup, to not have a lot of friends once you get between the 2 and the 10 million range. And you want to build, but all your skills were for starting, and building and starting are radically different exercises, as you know. So our mission was first to say, how do we create those jobs? And 6 years ago, we were looking for numbers of organizations around the country, and especially around the Front Range, that were dedicated to helping second stage companies that were beyond the startup, but not yet in the mid-markets. And we couldn't find anybody that really wanted to help, at least in mass. So we began a research effort that is the essence of TrueSpace, that is the essence of what you're going to hear Dr. Sangeeta Badal talk about tonight with us. And that is that we decided to embed ourselves with 150 companies over 4 years, from 2014 to 2018, and to try to find out what was happening in businesses that were in between the 2 and 10 million range, and how they were trying to build their businesses. And discovery is the best part of research, if those of you that have ever done research. The discovery we had is that there was 10%, 14 of those companies, that statistically and from a performance perspective, completely separated themselves from the base 133. 3 of these businesses went out of business in that period of time. And we discovered 5 operating conditions that they had created, in some cases inadvertently, in some cases purposefully, but the 5 operating conditions that existed there did not exist in the businesses that got stuck. So let me give you some things to think about. When we started this research, the average business in our cohort had $1.87 million in annualized revenues, the average business, and a few of you are actually in here. In that 4 years, we had 14 that went way past the $10 million range. They didn't grow quickly, they grew consistently. But we had the average of the 133 that were left over was 2.4 million. They grew from 1.87 to 2.4, and that's it. And yet, all of the companies worked just as hard. They had just as big of dreams, they had the great ambitions, and the delta was the 5 conditions that we identified. So we identified 5 operating conditions. That is the essence of what TrueSpace is all about. And we endeavored to build an assessment to go in and help an entrepreneur find out how his or her business was operating relative to the 5 conditions. And those of you that have ever worked in business, and many of you are in here that have built businesses and started them and sold them, timing is everything. It may be the most important part of any business growth. And we bumped into this little business called Gallup. Timing's everything, right, Heather? It's everything. So I don't know how it happened, but we ended up in Omaha, and we were there for a different reason, and we met this person. His name's Joe Daly. Is Joe in here someplace? Where is Joe? There's Joe. So Joe somehow, we're in Omaha, and they said, hey, you got to talk to this guy, Joe Daly, who's in Washington, D.C. And we get on this video conference call. We could actually see him, and lo and behold, we had this synergy around timing, and he and Dr. Sangeeta Badal had been working on the whole world of talent and entrepreneurs for multiple years, 7 to 8 years, and she'll tell you that story tonight. And it just so happened that there was a reason the 2 of us existed, and that's the story that we want to tell tonight. So what I'd like to do before I introduce Dr. Badal is, you can see that her book's back there. It's a Wall Street Journal bestseller. She's a lot of fun, and she's pretty funny. She's not as funny as I am, but she's pretty funny. I'm just joking, by the way. But I'd like to introduce you to these folks. Is that fair? So who you have in this room? You got invited by either one of our members, one of our partners, or directly by us. So what you have in this room are a set of entrepreneurs that have dedicated their life to building good businesses, meaningful businesses, sustainable businesses, and creating jobs. And then you have a partner ecosystem in here that's dedicated to helping them do that. And the third component we have in here are those that have evolved some type of capital formation to help the growth of second stage companies. The best thing for me when I look around this room tonight is that you're the people that we need in the Front Range community to actually help these companies get from 2 to 10, because even if we assessed 100% accuracy, we still need the help of everybody in this room to do this. You have to be dedicated past the startup. You have to help people get to this 10 million number, and the 10 million number gives an entrepreneur options that they don't have when they're not there. So let me talk about Dr. Badal today. She's been such a joy to work with. I was really intimidated. It's one of those people you walk into a room and you feel stupid immediately. I really don't know what I'm talking about. So she lives in Omaha, which is interesting because we're pretty close in proximity. I kind of expected her to be more corporate from, like Joe over in DC, the corporate crowd. By the way, Joe he's a senior partner at Gallup. Probably is going to be one of the people that lead the entire organization in the near future. So the fact that he came out here speaks pretty loudly for the organization as well. So thank you for being here. But Dr. Badal is the principal scientist at Gallup. And what that really means is that anybody and everybody within the Gallup research structure that's working on talent relative to entrepreneurs is getting direction from Sangeeta and her research. It's a really big deal when you think about the massive data that Gallup has at their fingertips in any given day. And what you're going to hear from her tonight is really the work that she's done on the BP10, but also the work that we are now working on together. So this is the structure we'd like to do. She is a professor, but she's also a great entertainer. I'd like her to talk maybe 35, 40 minutes around really the structure of especially the work that's in the book. And then she's going to talk about how we're putting that together with the 5 conditions. And then we'll go through Q&A. So about 40 minutes or so. Does that sound about right? And some Q&A? All right, Sangeeta, take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. It is unbelievably amazing to be here. I did. Can you hear me? I can speak louder. Okay. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. Joe and I both do. And I hope that we have more opportunities to meet as we continue to work with TrueSpace and make some amazing discoveries from our journey together. Today, I will start with a little background on how we started this work of entrepreneurship and job creation. It's an initiative within Gallup, and we are trying to learn as much as we can about who creates jobs, how are they created, how are they sustained, what role do entrepreneurs do, what role do different stage entrepreneurs play, and I will talk about some of our findings specifically from the psychological perspective, and I'll tell you how Gallup's viewpoint on entrepreneurial performance is different than some of the other well-known models and theories that we use in entrepreneurial performance understanding. So this is all about creating sustainable growth, and of course our partnership in using the framework that TrueSpace has created, as well as what Gallup has been working on the last about 7 or 8 years. I think we might be missing a slide here. Okay. Well, so that slide actually is really cool, isn't it? Who are the PowerPoint gods here? Just tell them about it. Okay. So we around 7-8 years ago, Gallup's World Poll data. For those of you, many of you might know that. Okay. Yeah. And we're missing a slide. The one with the macroeconomic data. I mean, the slides here, I think it's hidden or something. It's okay. So 7-8 years ago, Gallup World Poll data, which is a collection of political, social, economic and a bunch of other items that are asked about around 140 countries in the world. Consistently, the same items are asked to collect data over time. We've been doing it, I think, for about maybe 15 years now. And one of the things that, one of the big findings that was coming out of that was that all this social political unrest that we've been seeing in the Mideast, in other parts of the world, the underlying root cause of that was that people were looking for gainful employment. They were looking for jobs. They wanted to be productively involved in their economies. And so a team in DC led by, and Joe was part of that, started digging into how can we have any impact on this big finding that everyone in the world is looking for a job. There is an effort in Gallup that tries to measure the unemployment figures and to parse out the real and underemployment rather than just the government figures that we see, which are really low. There were efforts that also started looking at what are the places where jobs evolve, who creates these jobs, and we were looking at jobs that were high quality, so that is at least 30 hours. Our definition would be 30 hours of gainfully employed scenario would be considered as a full-time job. So some of the numbers that started coming out through that research were not very pleasant. We were looking at declining GDP per capita over time, which are those graphs I wanted to show you. I'm sorry if at some point it comes up, I'll share that. The number of companies that are going public has decreased over time, and these were long. So this is the declining per capita GDP growth rates. Here is the declining number of public companies that go public, declining IPOs, and then one that was really concerning, I'm sorry, can you guys see that? Was really concerning was the declining startups. So we are talking about employer businesses here. There are about 400,000 businesses as of today, well, the data is 2 years old, so I shouldn't say as of today, but the latest data that is available from Census, about 400,000 employer businesses created and about the same number die. So we are really not in a very good place. And this data is from 1975 all the way to 2016, I think, is the last data point we have on this slide. And there was a dip right where recession hit, and the birth rate actually fell below the death rate. So that means they weren't even replacing the number of companies that were dying. That was super concerning, and we started talking about what can we do about this. We need to have a bigger herd for some of these companies then to become bigger companies so that they could generate that employment and the jobs that we were talking about. Okay, so that happened. And then when we dug into the startup data a little bit more, are you guys getting a feedback where it's a disturbance? Sorry, guys. a lot too, which is probably contributing to this. Much, yes, okay. So there are very few that actually reach that stage. So that's concerning too. We need to not only have more startups, but also make sure that the ones that survive grow. And then we need to figure out something about that 50% death rate where companies aren't even surviving. I found this interesting little cartoon. I'm sure many of you can relate to it. So as you reach the summit and you start to celebrate that, yay, we are through the startup stage, and then there is that next big valley of death that I think Charles was referring to, and you can see the skeletons and the bones scattered there. So I guess things that make people who start companies and are able to get them through the startup stage, those characteristics sometimes don't really fit the next stage of business. And that's where that psychological piece that I'll now talk about really comes in handy, because then you start understanding, here's what I had, and this is what made me successful, but now not only do I need to change my psychology, but I also need to change my processes and systems and everything else that has to start being put into place to make that next hike. So it's tiny little celebration, and then it's a lot of very hard work that has to follow. And I think I'm talking to the crowd that knows this more than anyone else. So what is our unique contribution? R means Gallup's unique contribution to this field. There's, of course, so much research that's happening in trying to drive business success, these outcomes, the performance we want, to have people start businesses. New methodologies or methodologies that have been adopted from other fields are being brought in to make sure that we can give and equip our entrepreneurs with everything possible for their success. One thing we saw was that there was so much attention paid to what I have termed here as ecological factors. So these include not only the contextual factors in which the industry in which the business is started, the environment, the policy environment, the rules that the entrepreneurs have to play by, the tax structure, and all those macroeconomic issues, but also the organizational issues, what kind of structure there is, who is at the helm of the company, what kind of team is there, how many employees do they have, what are the employee management processes, what is the selection hiring process, etc. So those all fit into what we call the contextual factors, and there, of course, is a lot of research that is being done in terms of understanding what those determinants of that success on the other side of the equal sign are or could be. One thing that is less discussed, or even if it's discussed, it's harder to measure, is the psychology of the individual who's at the helm of that, who's at the center of it. What is the decision-making process? How does the person think? What are the fears and the biases the individual has? And how do those biases then play out in business decisions that then affect those outcomes? And so the psychology piece is something that Gallup not only has a huge, long history in terms of understanding what makes an individual a fit for a role, and what are those characteristics within that individual that drive performance that is suited for the role. How does the individual meet the demands of the role, so to speak, and is then successful? So what we are trying to bring together is these two things, the individual and the understanding of the individual, and then helping that person be self-aware about that, so there is that developmental aspect to it, and then tie that together with the organizational factors, or things, for instance, the 5 conditions that the TrueSpace framework has brought out on what are some of the systems and functions and conditions that have to be fulfilled for the business to be successful. So the marriage of these two is what makes our model strong. And if we leave either of these, then we, of course, have misspecified or inaccurate models of determining business success. So that's Gallup's unique point of view in terms of our contribution to looking at entrepreneurship through the lens of psychology. So let me introduce you to to the theoretical basis for what we have built. And what you see here, let me know if I start getting in your way of looking at these slides. this is a variant of Amsterdam Geisen model. It's two psychologists who came up with understanding how do you take the innate traits, the personality pieces of an individual, and then tie them to business outcomes. So what this model says is that traits that are very specific to entrepreneurship, think risk-taking, think self-efficacy, think determination, think the ability to get over obstacles, think the ability to sell. So these are specific traits, not generic personality traits like extroversion and introversion. You probably have seen research around that too. The only thing is that the big five, like those more generic personality measures, do not really have the same predictive power because they're distal from the outcomes that we are trying to measure, right? So specific traits that are close or proximal to entrepreneurship then affect behaviors of that individual. Those are the visible pieces of personality, right? The pieces that we can observe, the observable part. So the traits affect, the proximal traits affect behaviors, which in turn affect outcomes. So I'll give you one example and then we'll move ahead. I think we have a lot of ground to cover. I could spend a lot of time in explaining this. So risk taker. Who do we call a risk taker? Someone who starts a business knowing that the probability of success is really, really low. What are some of the behaviors of a risk taker? These people have very high failure tolerance. These people, people who have high ability to manage risk, take a very analytical approach to risk management or risk taking. And when I say analytical approach, I mean they will calculate the odds, they will gather all the information about whatever situation there is that they are going to try to make a decision about. And this whole calculating the odds, creating what if scenarios, and gathering all the information available, all that time and effort that they put into doing what I would call their homework makes them feel like I can make this decision and this is not risky. Now, to an outsider, that decision might look really risky. But for the individual who has the ability to mitigate or manage that risk, those behaviors will not seem or will take away some of the inherent risk in that situation, and that person will go ahead and make that decision and then move on. What are the outcomes of that, of those behaviors that we see for people who are good at managing that risk? Some of the outcomes are they're very quick to figure out the gaps in the market. They are usually the ones who are first to jump into something that they see is a need or is a gap. They're also really, really good about bouncing back from a setback. It's hard for them to stay down very, very long, even after a really hard failure. It's possible for them to move on and then move on to the next thing, and then do the same homework and figure out the same environment and then make that decision again. So this is that theoretical model that we've used in terms of building what Gallup built, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. So we built this assessment, which is called Builder Profile 10. A little explanation on why builder and not entrepreneur. I think we are looking at a wider group of people that we call builders, anyone who creates economic energy, anyone who can find a customer. So a dentist who's building a practice, a pastor who's building a congregation, a student who's building an app and puts it out on some app engine. Any person who's building something and can find a customer is creating economic energy, which leads to economic contribution and growth. So we have the Silicon Valley high-tech entrepreneurs covered, but we also have a large swath of other economic activity that's happening in our economies and is important to foster. This tool that we built, the Builder Profile 10, basically is a tool that measures an individual's potential to be successful as a builder. So there's a test that has about 140 some items, takes about 30 minutes. It's a structured web assessment. And those of you who are taking a copy of the book home will have the opportunity to take it. There is a code that is on the back flap of this that allows you to take the assessment. And as soon soon as you take the assessment, you get a report with these 10 talents. So these are the 10 talents which are basically demands of the role of an entrepreneur. So we did job analysis and stakeholder interviews with successful entrepreneurs to understand what is it that they do on a day-to-day basis to be successful. That's the information that the psychologists on the staff of Gallup took to identify the traits that would lead to those behaviors that we heard in the stakeholder interviews, etc. So from all that gathering of the information, qualitative and then quantitative, we tested the initial set of items that we drew from Gallup's 40-year-old database of items that we've used for selecting just about every possible position on the face of this earth. We drew out the items that talk to those traits and then tested them on samples of entrepreneurs, high school students, college students, non-entrepreneurs, the general population, that's working age population, and distilled these 10 that are like the demands of the role. These are things you have to do to be successful. And it's very rare for individuals to have all 10 at a very high intensity. That's where teams come in play. That's where partnerships come into play. So if you are really high in delegation and you don't have much of selling, then you do need to find a partner who is really good at selling, at looking at profitability, at looking at gathering information or what we call knowledge about the business to create that team that would then be successful. So the other thing about each of these 10 is that each one of them has a specific outcome that it is tied to. So sometimes people will ask, okay, what is more important? Like, is there one that you can say really drives entrepreneurial activity? And my answer is no. For those who've started businesses, you know how complex that task is. You have an idea, you put resources together, you figure out what your team is, you start something, you find the customer, then you retain that customer and find another one. I mean, there's this host of activity of things that have to be done, and there's no one single trait that can take care of it. You need to have a spread of 10 to be able to meet the demands of that role, and so it's important to look at all 10. So the report that you will get, I'll show you the report, which will have those 10 in a descending order. So you'll have your strongest at the top and the least strong at the bottom, which gives you then an idea of where do I need to find partnerships. And we'll talk about a team example of how people use that. But before that, here is a little bit of a validation for the tool. So we had the Inc. 500. Our database consists of working age adults in United States, Germany, and about 20 other countries. We have large swaths of people from Mexico, where we've run very large projects, especially high school student projects, which is early identification of talent and helping them understand that entrepreneurial path could be a way for them. And we have the Inc. 500. And so here, what you see on this slide is the performance of the Inc. 500 on the BP10, which helps us feel good that this assessment is able to distinguish between the average national sample. This is a probability-based representative sample of entrepreneurs in United States. The fun part of working in Gallup is that I can say this because we have it. So there is the nationally representative sample of entrepreneurs in United States compared to the Inc. 500, and you can see that the Inc. 500 and their performance criteria is validated by an external source, right? It's not Gallup who's gathering this information. We know that they are selected because they're 4 years old, they have revenue numbers that they have met from year 1 to year 3, etc. And so look at their profile, which tells us, which then tells us that this assessment is able to distinguish and to select or differentiate is the word I'm looking for, between the entrepreneurs that are likely to be less successful versus entrepreneurs that are likely to be more successful. Okay, here are some business outcomes that we've noticed so far. People who have high ability to manage risk are 3.5 times more likely to be serial builders. People who are strong disruptors, so they have very high score on the BP10 disruptor theme, are 3 times more likely to have received or filed. People who have a high score in profitability are 5 times more likely to have revenue over 1 million. And I kept a pretty low bar. I mean, you can imagine a national sample of entrepreneurs. Majority of the entrepreneurs, of course, don't have this. I have businesses that are in revenue as small as 50,000, 20,000, 40,000, and then we have very small sample that is above 1 million. So I kept that threshold, but you can see that someone who has high profitability is more likely to have a business that is a larger size business than an average business, which is I think around 300,000 in United States. And then someone who has high self-efficacy, which is measured by confidence, the name of the theme is confidence, is 3 times more likely to increase their employee base. So they are more likely to have larger size businesses in terms of the number of employees. Here's what the report looks like. So for those of you who've taken it, you know that. And for those of you who will be taking it, I hope you do. You will get a report. We call this the developmental report. And what this does is it gives you an idea of what are your strongest and the less strong themes for you or dimensions that you can utilize then in terms of using it for your work. What we recommend is, and that's the reason the first page of this report that you will get, is focus on the first 4. Why 4? There's no, I mean, I can't say there's a scientific reason of 4. The reason we picked 4 as a number is because irrespective of the level of talent someone has, it's really hard to take care of all these demands of the role by the single individual, right? So 4 gives you enough room to select the ones that you align yourself most with, that you feel you psychologically own, and say, I know I'm really good at selling, so I'm going to devote my time to honing that part of my talent and getting the outcomes that my business needs. So you get the first 4. You also get right at the bottom here, in, if you can see, is the role that you are most likely to be a good fit for in a startup environment. So how this came about is that we were working with an accelerator, and there were these early stage businesses of, I think, a particular industry, and there were about 20 teams in there. And one of the things we kept hearing again and again is that, look, in a startup, each one of us is doing everything that needs to be done to just get through the day, right? There is no role differentiation. But the ones that were starting to see the pipeline of the work and the customers fill up, they were the ones who were like, okay, who should do what in our team now? I started this company with my best friend or my colleague or my brother or sister or family member, and each one of us has been doing whatever, but now we need some role definition. So what we have done here is there are 3 indices that come out of the same assessment. So when you take the assessment, based on how you answer those questions, we can determine what is the likely fit of the individual for the role. So we have 3. Rainmaker, I think that's also on this beautiful bookmark that you've got in your in the book, thanks to TrueSpace team. And Rainmaker, expert, and conductor. So Rainmaker has the characteristics more around selling and profitability and looking to the future vision and being able to see what the business would look like in 5, 10, 15 years. So the big vision person, also the one who is getting the revenue, generating revenue for the company. Expert is the person who manages the product development, someone who's more the intersection of a scientist and an artist who's building things and breaking things and figuring out what the customer needs and you know, creating the prototype and then the final product and consistently improving upon it to meet the market needs. And then you have the conductor, who is kind of like a glue between all these different pieces that are going on in a business environment, because without a conductor, you wouldn't be able to grow. That's the person who puts processes and systems and, you know, here's our hiring system. This is how we onboard people. This is what we tell when we onboard people. This is what our mission and and purpose is, and everyone needs to be aligned and on the same page around it. Here's how we pay people. Here's how we promote people. This is how the production process works. And I'll share with you a story about a team I worked with and how some of the rainmakers reacted to this task that they had to do. But so you also get that indicator in there. Now, it's possible that some of you might be a hybrid. So even though the engine that kicks out this report, which is an automated report, will pick one because we have written a code that would force, based on the scoring, to pick one role. But it's possible that you might align yourself with, I'm an expert, but I'm also a conductor. So you could be a hybrid of expert conductor. You could be a rainmaker conductor, or you could just be one role that you identify yourself with, or where you've seen success. So this gives you an idea. And then forming teams is where this is critically important in terms of bringing other people on. Here's another report which gives you much more insight. So this is where you now have scores. The first one was developmental. So you got your teams, but you got them in descending order, and you got to know where you're really strong and some middle and some bottom. This is where your scores are compared to two normative samples: the general population, working age adults, and the top quartile of entrepreneurs in the Gallup database. So those top quartile include Inc., but there's a larger sample of similarly performing businesses that form the top quartile in the Gallup database. So the top part, the top graph is 52 is the score of the individual, and then there are the two benchmarks, so you can see how you compare to general population versus some of the top in your role. And then on the bottom is those 10 themes arranged exactly the same way as you would see on your developmental report. But in this case now, you get an idea of the intensity of talent. You get to see how much of that talent is present. And also this, again, is a wonderful way to begin to think about partnerships and bringing other people on, and how do you make it work. So there's an interesting example, if I can share it now, Charles. We were looking at the data earlier this morning, and there was this individual data that we were looking at and had pretty high 5 condition scores. So the assessment that TrueSpace has, that individual had performed really high on that entrepreneur. However, when we moved over to looking at the BP10 data, the talent was average there. And so we started having a discussion of what does that pattern show us. And Charles, of course, knows these businesses personally, and said that, and he guessed, he was not looking at the data, and he said, I think this person is a conductor. And I scrolled ahead and saw that, yes, indeed, the person, the entrepreneur was a conductor. And he said, this is not the person who started the business. This is the person who's scaling this business, who's helping the founders scale the business. So the assessment has picked up that piece of it where this is the person who's a conductor. He is able to take care of those 5 conditions that are really important to scale the business, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he has this raw entrepreneurial talent of the one that is getting the revenue, the one that is creating the product, right? And we'll talk more about that combination of these 2 pieces, the piece that is the TrueSpace framework, which tells you what are the conditions that have to be met for business to scale, and the understanding of the psychology of the individual, or I would say individuals, so teams that are running that business. And that creates that richness of data that you could have amazing time trying to find the little pearls that would help you understand what makes this individual tick, and how is this business where it is, and what do they need in the future that we could fulfill based on that talent map, etc. One thing about this report, the reason you don't get that report is that we really encourage people to work with coaches to make sense of this information, and to work to create a strategy for your business that suits your business and the stage of business you're at. So that's the reason it's called Coaches Insight Report. Coaches who are trained by Gallup, and you work with them can pull this report for you and then have a conversation. Okay, so we've talked already quite a bit about team building, and I think the talent-based team building is much more superior to random putting together of people, or even if there are historical relationships between people who are working as a team. I think it's important to understand where the talents lie. So if you're building a new team, I would strongly recommend utilizing a theoretical basis like BP10 would give you in terms of understanding what those roles should be. And if you already have an existing team, and I'll discuss one in a minute, then you can see where those strengths are, where the gaps are, and how do you fulfill those gaps by creating other partnerships and networks. So there are the three that I mentioned before. Won't spend any time on this. Here's an example. Are we doing good on time? 10 minutes, okay. So this is an example of a fintech business in the fintech industry, 5-year-old, real business in Omaha, Nebraska. We had the good fortune to work with them, with the executive team. There are 3 members. 2 of them are rainmakers and 1 is expert. So in the early stages, of course, of the business, everyone's doing everything, generating business, managing the workflow, getting the product out to the customers. So Blanca, who's the expert, is the one who's this awesome programmer, and she's the one who's created the technology and continues to 100% focus on that. And then there are these 2 what I call generalists, but these are hard-charging, salesy kind of persons who love to be in front of the customer and create relationships and network and get revenue and generate business. So after 5 years, they got their first $1 million, first investor, and complexity starts to come in. So now they have to set up a board. The board has to be these 3, the investor and another person, which has to be agreed upon by the investor and the team members. So there is that business need where they need to figure out who that person should be. And we help them do that through the talent assessment. So you can see their top 4. They're also, as the business was, the pipeline was filling up and they needed to serve customers, they started realizing that we might need another employee because Blanca was taking up the complete load of developing the product. And so she needed to move on to more strategic thinking about the product long term versus in the nitty-gritty of programming. And so they needed to hire their first employee in 5 years, and they needed to have a board member. 2 things right off the bat. When we looked at their profile, we saw that Amrita and Jordan have very similar profiles. They are both highly confident, salesy personalities, high determination. Amrita lacks a little bit of focus on profitability, which Jordan makes up for. And then what Jordan lacks in risk-taking, Amrita has that piece. So they work really well with each other. However, as the business was growing, and Amrita was the one that was the bigger shareholder and was the one who had to take on the CEO role. She was the most likely person to be the CEO. Jordan, we had to figure out the role definition for Jordan. And even though they were really happy in the 5 years that they had been working together and had a good relationship, it's complicated when the business starts growing and there are 2 people that are doing exactly the same thing and going after the same outcomes. And so we recommended to them that knowing Jordan's profile, you need to have a clear definition between who's making decisions on what part of the business. So there has to be one ultimate authority, and then there has to be differentiation between every single role so that you're not ever on each other's toes. So because of this, all 3 of them were in the same room with 2 Gallup consultants. And that conversation, which could have been a difficult conversation, became an easier conversation because there was this psychologically safe space that you create when you're talking about, here's what I'm good at, here's what I can do, these are the tasks I can really fulfill, these are the outcomes I can affect in this business. And so they start taking ownership over it. They start accepting that this is what they would do. One of the things they, like I said, needed, and you can see around here, There's no relationship building talent other than in Blanca, who was the expert. She's not in front of customers. She's never networking. She's only in her lab making that product. So her relationship talent is not being utilized by this team. They needed someone who could be promoting their business in the fintech industry, someone who can be talking about with a loud mouthpiece to the world of, here are the great things happening in this company. Look, this new upcoming startup that is now crossed over, has survived, is sustainable. They decided to do a BP10 on a couple of people they were considering for that board position. Remember, that was one of the business needs they had. And they wanted to get someone who has very strong advocacy and promoting skills. They needed someone who had selling, but they needed someone who had wider network than their investor. Their investor is very knowledgeable about the fintech industry. However, he's not a promoter. He's not someone who can stand on the rooftops and shout out good things about this business. And so for them, it was, and they came to this understanding on their own as we were talking about these talents and what they need and who could fulfill that role and what kind of individual do you need to fit in with the team. So they made a decision on an individual based on the talent profile and the gaps that they had in their talent, as well as they hired their first employee based on the gaps that they saw in their team. They needed someone who was independent. They don't have time to micromanage someone. It's a very small team, as you can see. They wanted someone with stellar, of course, technical skills so that Blanca could be relieved from her day-to-day programming position. But they needed someone who would take good guidance from, strategic guidance from Blanca. And so they filled that position again based on the understanding of this interplay of dynamics in a team. And when you go through an exercise like this and you continue to use and keep front of mind the talents that you have, the interpersonal relationships improve. You begin to understand why someone does what they do. The likelihood of any kind of conflict goes down drastically. You create psychologically safe space where you can talk to each other. You can make decisions in a way that takes care of that inter-team dynamic. There are some questions. I think I've answered every single one of them here for you in telling you the story, but these questions guided them through that conversation. So I would highly recommend when you take the BP10, let your team take the BP10 too, and then sit down and have that conversation and see where that goes. To the most fun part. So as Charles had said, he met with the Gallup team in DC and realized that we had an amazing synergy. They had been working the last 6-7 years on really understanding a framework that would help us understand what scales businesses from a systems perspective. And here we had been spending about the same time in trying to understand what is the psychology of the individual and how does that drive performance in a business environment. And so coming together of these two just seemed like a natural fit, where we now have those two parts of the equation that I showed you up front, the psychology and the ecology. And I think if we can look at these synergistically and how they work together, we will be able to drive more success in the segment that we want. So what we've done so far, Charles had already put in about 6 years and empirically worked a conceptual framework. So he had